the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome. This is Crystal and David Downing, co-directors of the Marion E. Wade Center, and we're joined by our podcast producer, Erin Hill, to talk about The Abolition of Man, which C.S. Lewis once described as his best work. Well, let's talk about the context of The Abolition of Man. David, why don't you give us background to it?
Lewis was invited to give the Riddell Lectures by the University of Durham, and they took place in February 1943. So it is a series of lectures on 3 evenings, which were later published as The Abolition of Man. And actually, they were delivered in Newcastle on Tyne. There wasn't an auditorium big enough for his talk at Durham. It's interesting that people often read this book with that hideous strength. And hideous strength sort of works out novelistically some of the same issues that we find discussed. In Abolition of Man, he says sometimes the dangerous person, the conditioner, it could be a mild-eyed man wearing a pince nez. And then you read that hideous strength and one of the villains wears a pince nez.
Oh.
Interesting connections.
What are the Riddell lectures typically about? Like often those lectures have a theme or a purpose to them.
Yeah, every year a significant scholar is asked to come and talk about philosophy and morality.
Gotcha, philosophy and morality.
So some people complain, well, why did he just say the moral law comes from God? But this is to an academic audience,
Gotcha.
Not to a Christian audience.
Yeah.
And so he was seeking to establish the idea of a universal morality apart from Christian theology. So it could include people of all religions.
Right. And actually, he had this interest before he became a Christian. When in his 20s, he gave a lecture called The Hegemony of Moral Values. And the good, its place among the values. So philosophically, he always had a feeling that we need to stress the idea of objective moral values. And he was quoting Plato and Aristotle and Augustine back in the 20s before he became a Christian.
Interesting. Well, because it was the Riddell Lectures, it's divided into 3 sections that correspond to the 3 lectures.
Correct.
And the very first one is called Men Without Chests. And maybe we should...
That's surprising because it was about the lack of exercise in the modern world. People just don't work out as much as they should.
Men with sunken chests.
Exactly.
Maybe we should talk about how he approaches that, and then you can explain why he calls it Men Without Chests. Lewis begins his lectures in this section called Men Without Chests, indicting a book that he calls the Green Book.
Yeah.
And it is a book titled The Control of Language.
Oh, okay.
That happens to be green. And what is really cool is the Wade Center owns C.S. Lewis's copy of The Control of Language. And so we have C.S. Lewis's annotations in the margins of this book. And so Lewis starts his lectures on philosophy and morality appealing to this book that he couldn't stand. Do you remember any of the marginalia, David, that is in the book The Wade owns?
Well, yes, the section on the waterfall early
I was
in
going
the
to
book.
say, yeah.
He has this incident where Coleridge talks about someone looking at a waterfall, and someone called it sublime, which he certainly agreed with, and then someone else called it pretty.
Yeah.
And actually, Ketley and King, the people who wrote The Control of Language, they didn't even get the anecdote right.
Well, I was going to say, but Lewis's account doesn't seem to get the anecdote right either, because I went and looked up the original document, and it's slightly different there as well.
Right. In their version, first it was a man who said sublime, and then it was a woman who said pretty, and Coleridge was very upset by it. In the actual incident, it was the same tourist who called it sublime, and then he called it pretty. And Coleridge was actually more amused than he was upset. This goes back to sublimity is a feeling of awe or reverence or something very larger than yourself. Wasn't it Burke who talked about the sublime and the beautiful was the first essay. If you see a beautiful bird, you say, oh, how exquisite, how wonderful.
Right, 1757.
Yes,
Edmund
I was
Burke.
just going to say that, 1757. I can't remember if it was earlier in the year or later in the year. In any case, he said the sublime is different than looking at a beautiful bird. It's big and it's imposing and it makes you feel small. And it's a very different emotional response than a response to the beautiful or the pretty or the exquisite. And so part of the humor of the incident is this general citizen had no sense of the difference between the sublime and the beautiful. When Lewis was reading that, first of all, they didn't tell the story right. It's slightly sexist.
In the Green Book.
In the Green Book. They have a man saying sublime and a woman saying beautiful. The subtext is, oh, women don't get it. But in the book, they say, well, actually, there's nothing sublime about the waterfall. It's just gravity. It's a bunch of water which is going down from a high place to a low place. And so the sublime is just your feeling, your response to that. And he put confusion. And then it turned and said, when you say that's sublime, you're actually reporting I'm having sublime feelings. And Lewis wrote, confusion confounded. Because your feelings are not, you don't feel intimidating and imposing and awe-inspiring. You feel small and vulnerable. And so he said he's getting it exactly backwards. The bigness and the power of the waterfall makes you feel small, but it's a pleasurable feeling.
Oh, by comparison.
Right.
Gotcha.
And that is what Lewis hates about the Green Book, or the control of language, in that it is implying that all value judgments, like aesthetic values, are subjective.
Right.
And so what Lewis is really responding to is a movement that had started in the 20s and was still strong in the 40s when he is giving these lectures, called logical positivism.
Yeah.
Right.
And the idea that only statements about empirically verifiable reality can be called true. And hence, any statements about God, any statements about beauty, you can't call those true.
Yeah.
They're just subjective responses. And one of the people that Lewis quotes and refers to multiple times in The Abolition of Man is I.A. Richards, who is a literary critic that was influenced by logical positivism. And I just want to read something by I.A. Richards, and you'll understand why Lewis had so much problem with logical positivism. Richards says, and he's a literary critic, so he values poetry. He says, countless pseudo statements about God, about the universe, about human nature. Okay, anything you can't prove, that's just a pseudo statement. About the soul, its rank and destiny, have suddenly become, for sincere, honest, and informed minds, impossible. For centuries they have been believed. Now they are gone irrevocably. However, if we can contrive to believe poetry, then the world seems, while we do so, to be transfigured. And you see a reflection here of what has been called the religion of art, as people, especially influenced by logical positivism, gave up on any religion. You can't verify it. You can't prove it in a scientific laboratory.
Yeah.
But people were despairing over the loss of religious certitude. And so Richard says, well, that's why we need poetry, because that'll make you feel better.
Classic statement of logical positivists is things are only true if they can be proven deductively. A bachelor is an unmarried man, or inductively. I measured and I discovered that it's about 93 million miles to the sun. And the rejoinder is, well, how about that statement? Is that deductive or inductive?
Yeah.
You just put together a truth statement which doesn't follow your own rules.
Yeah.
Here's like a good book you're reading from, Crystal. What is that?
I was going to say, Crystal has a book that she's getting all these quotes from. What book is that, Crystal?
It is called How Postmodernism Serves My Faith.
By Crystal, wait for it, Downing.
Okay, so anyway, you can understand why Lewis is upset by this attitude that he sees developing within the academy. And so he wants to do something that he says we are called to teach just sentiments, rather than just say, you think it's pretty, I think it's sublime. That's just your own subjective response.
You say tomato, I say tomato. In a way, it's it is implying that moral values are subjective. He was saying that in the ancient world, the classical world, he starts with Plato and says that they believed that the human being had a head, which is your rational faculty, and had a belly, which is your appetites. But between the two, you need the chest, which is the source of moral and aesthetic judgments. And people will reason well or badly, but they'll naturally try to think about things.
Yeah.
And they naturally have appetites. You don't have to tell a child to be hungry or to be tired, but they don't naturally learn an appropriate emotional response to goodness and beauty.
Yeah.
And so the idea was we have to cultivate these things in our children. Aristotle said we want them to approve the good and the beautiful, and we want them to disapprove of the unjust or the, what's the word for not beautiful? The ugly. So men without chests, the metaphor is that we have human beings who are reasoning. They're doing a lot of wonderful things in science and technology, and they're certainly fulfilling their appetites, but they're not getting a good moral education. They're reading books like this one, the Green Book, and it sounds like any moral judgment or aesthetic judgment is arbitrary and unimportant.
Right.
So that's where he's going with that metaphor.
It explains why I'm reading I.A. Richards from my book about postmodernism, because essentially what Lewis is reacting against, and I quote him in my postmodernism book, he would have loved postmodernism because he reacted against modernist autonomy. Modernism was about, we are autonomous, we don't believe there's a God anymore, we just evolved here on earth. And even modernist art is autonomous. When you think of abstract expressionism, it doesn't relate to anything you've ever seen.
Yeah.
It's just the projection of the artist's vision onto the canvas.
Abstract shapes and colors.
You know, I have my autonomous subjective feelings, and I can't question your feelings. And it sounds like the Green Book was in that tenor. So postmodernism is attacked modernist autonomy and showed how simplistic it was. And so C.S. Lewis is echoing several postmodern theories in Abolition of Man.
Although there is a problem when you talk about truth, goodness, and beauty, people often roll those three off as kind of a Neoplatonic trinity.
Yeah.
Right.
But I would argue that you can't look at them the same. To me, truth is the best argument for objective truth. If I say the sun is 93 million miles away, you can't say, oh, really? For me, it's more like 80 million.
I feel like it's closer.
Yeah, I'm feeling that it's
that's
closer
what
than
logical
that.
positivists said.
Yeah.
Well, something that can be measured, something that can be tested is true. Everything else is a pseudo statement.
Right, and that's where they got into trouble. There was a famous debate where the bishop says, well, when I to me, God, and the person said, that's a nonsense term. Well,
Right.
I think morality, that term has no meaning. And
Right.
basically they were saying if it wasn't deductive or inductive, it has no meaning.
But I mean, surely you could argue, and I guess maybe this is part of one of my criticisms here of Lewis, that he doesn't kind of complete the circle on his comments about the Green Book is, I mean, you could argue there's a right and a wrong way to feel about murder. That seems to be pretty obvious. I mean, it's kind of self-evident, but not necessarily that there's a right way and a wrong way to react to waffles or waterfalls. You know what I mean?
I was going to say a minute ago, truth, goodness, and beauty. I think truth is the most easy to defend objectivity.
Yeah.
With goodness, he has an appendix where he says that all cultures, he got out this 13-volume encyclopedia of religion and ethics. And he finds there's a very broad consensus about murder, about adultery, about cowardice, about betraying your kindred. But the question does come up, what about different views of consensual sex? The Greeks believed that you could you could have a relationship with a child. Sometimes in Islamic cultures, you can marry a 13-year-old. And Americans would object to that. Both liberal and conservative Americans would. So there are areas where it's more subjective than the distance to the... No, I would claim that beauty is even more subjective. I had a friend who's been a lifelong patron of the arts who went to a recent exhibit at the Chicago Museum of Art. and was just really disappointed and appalled by what was on the walls. It's getting into novelty and personal statement. And there's no sense of either the craftsmanship of the artist or the vision of the artist. And I sometimes have that reaction. And so it's harder for me, it's harder to say there are objective values of beauty that everybody agrees on. Because highly educated people can look at a painting and say, "Oh, that's excellent, that's wonderful."
Yeah.
And other people will say, "Oh, my granddaughter could do that, or a monkey could do that."
Yeah.
Which is different from arguing the distance to the sun or the moon,
or even arguing that murder is wrong. Yeah. So you just explained, David, Men Without Chests, how the reason, in conjunction with our emotions and sentiments, help control our appetites, right?
Well, I wouldn't throw in emotions. It's mainly aesthetic judgments and moral judgments. You can have different emotional responses to things which don't have. If you go to a soccer match, some people are going to be very happy because their team won, and some are going to be sad because their team lost, but that doesn't have any moral content. So I wouldn't throw the word emotions in there. I would say emotional responses to things should be proper. The other day, you and I were driving to campus, and these 4 boys had this 5th boy who was smaller down on the ground. And I was just I told Crystal to stop the car. I wanted to jump out and say, "You get away from that kid, leave him alone." And all the cliches come up, like pick on somebody your own size. And I wanted to say, as I knew they would run away, and I wanted to say, "You can run from me, but you can't run from yourselves." But just then, the kid's mother drove up, and he ran to the car. And I was really angry. I really wanted to chase these kids and, give them a good talking to.
Yeah. But
I didn't want to end up in court later on saying that you jumped out of a car and you chased some junior high kids and you sat them down for a lecture. But my response of anger was really justified. And I didn't even know the little boy they were picking on.
Yeah.
But I had a feeling of that's just wrong.
Yeah, bullying is wrong.
Yeah. I think Lewis could have chosen some better examples.
Right. But his idea in this first section, because the first section he's responding basically to the Green Book and
the idea that values are subjective. Right?
And he's saying if you need to teach just sentiments, we see that all the time. Last time I was on a plane, a mother had a little 3-year-old with her trying to get to the restroom, and there was this long line, and the 3-year-old was squirming. So the man in front of the two of them turned around, saw the situation, and he said, "Oh, why don't you go first?" And I think everybody sitting around us admired that man, even though he technically had the right. He was in line before this mother with her little son, but he recognized that this act of graciousness, and everybody around would recognize that.
Yeah.
But then the mother trained her child how to respond. And she said, "Timmy, say thank you." And we all see parents educating their children in
polite responses.
Yeah. And
you
consideration for others.
Right.
And you share your toys. And even parents who have no religion teach their children to share their toys, right? And so for Lewis then, since people without religion recognize that there are these universal principles, he is positing this idea of a Tao. That
I would want to add on the waiting in line for a bathroom. We all admire that when you allow a child to go. I just want to expand that to old people. Normally, if there's an old person behind you in line, they need to get there before you do. Lewis talks about the development of the Tao, and I think one development would be old people as well as children. By the Tao, he's purposely not wanting to inject a Christian foundation for morality.
Yeah.
He's already given...
He lumps like Chinese and Jewish and Christian together.
Right. Because he wants to say there's a universal recognition of moral truths.
Right. And he's already given the first lecture of Mere Christianity on the radio in 42. And his opening thing was right and wrong is a clue to the universe. And in many ways, this can be read with Mere Christianity because he says we all know there's some sort of moral principles that we have to agree on, and we all know that we fall short ourselves.
Yeah.
And so the reason he talks about the Tao, it's pronounced with a D sound rather than a T
Tao
sound.
instead of the Tao.
Yeah, rather than quoting the Bible, he says, let's look at Confucianism, Buddhism, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Babylonians, and he throws in a few from the Bible. And even without reference to a creator or a lawgiver, there's just empirically strong evidence that human beings tend to have a similar set of values.
Mm-hmm. And what does Tao mean?
It means
The way, doesn't it? That's why he calls the second section the way.
Yeah, I was thinking of the stock market, and I said, I'm sure that's not right. People will listen to this and they'll go, well, I'm not even invested in the Dow. Why should I?
S&P 500?
Yeah, exactly.
It's spelled T-A-O.
Yeah,
the Dow.
I can't remember. It means several things. It's very untranslatable. But the interesting thing about the Tao is it's a fabric of morals. It's not one thing like do not kill, and they all balance each other out. Lewis actually has Confucius saying, if you pull one strand out, you spoil the tapestry. Now, the time he's writing, the Nazis are saying there's a certain goodness, which is love of kindred, love of family, love of the clan, trying to stick together.
Love of country.
Love of country.
Yeah.
It's generally good, but the Nazis were saying, no, the Germans are the pure race, the Aryans.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're eliminating Jews and gypsies and gay people. And so they took this one strand, which is love of kindred, and they made that,
into their absolute.
canceled out all the other strands.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the Bolsheviks are saying society's unjust. We need to move toward a just egalitarian society, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, we're going to have to kill about 30 million people, but once we get rid of our adversaries, we're going to have this ideal society. So they took what's generally good, which is looking out for your children, looking out for posterity, trying to make a better world for the future. But they canceled out "thou shalt not kill." You should be just, treat people equally. So he was seeing a lot of examples of societies where they were taking one strand of the Tao, one thread of the tapestry, and trying to make that the whole picture. And you end up with these horrendous immoralities in the name of a better society or a better future.
Right. Hence why he objects so strongly to the Green Book, because if you reduce values to subjectivity, you just say, well, I just subjectively think that Jews need to be eliminated, you'll endorse the Holocaust.
Well, for them, it wasn't subjective. This goes back to the head versus the chest versus the belly. For them, it was rational. The Jews have been controlling all the money. They have too much power and influence. They're not like us. They don't share our values.
According to the Nazis.
According to the Nazis.
Just clarifying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that.
These are not the opinions of David Downing.
Yeah.
Do not make that the teaser to begin.
Yeah.
Downing. And so they're being very rational in their minds, but they're abrogating very basic principles of valuing human life and, of course, of justice and equality.
Right. I was just reading Parade magazine last week, and I think the only people who read Parade magazine are baby boomers. But there was an interview with Ted Danson, who was a star of Cheers and then a popular show called The Good Place. And they asked him a question saying, The Good Place got people to think about what it means to do the right thing. Are you satisfied with that as its takeaway? And Ted Danson says, yes. Try to be the best you can every day. We're not going to become monks or philosophers overnight, but you do know what's ethically right, especially the longer you've been on the planet. He's appealing to a Tao.
That's right. So that would be like Ted Dowson.
What I like about this section called The Way, or the Tao, is C.S. Lewis shows the contradictions within the thought process of what he calls the innovators. And again, he's thinking of modernists. And he says that an innovator says you ought to obey instinct. And he points out that very sentence is self-contradictory, because if you ought to obey instinct, instinct will tell you what to do. But you, Mr. Green Book innovator, are telling me what to do. You're telling me the ought. And that is a good example of deconstruction. C.S. Lewis is practicing deconstruction in the section where he's showing that people's very language undermines what they're trying to say.
He also says it's unhelpful because it's like saying you ought to obey people. If you go by a burning building and you hear someone crying out, one instinct is, I have to help them. And another instinct is, I have to preserve my own life. I don't want to run into that building and get
self-preservation,
burned. Right. So he makes the very obvious point that instincts are often at war and you can't say, obey your instinct. Some judgment, some moral judgment has to make you decide which instinct to follow.
Yeah. He uses the example in this chapter, and he likes to use this example of someone dying for a good cause, like death for a good cause.
Right.
And he's kind of arguing that, if you go with that argument about instinct for reason, well, then you would be trying to preserve yourself. So what is it that causes you to then decide, I should die so that someone else or a community should live? Where does the ought for that come from? And he's trying to argue, if you give up on this idea of like self-evident truths, then there's nothing for it to be founded on. You kind of lose the ought in the scenario.
Right. He says you can't move from is to ought. And he says even in writing this book, they're thinking if we clarify the thinking of high school students, we eventually will have a better society. So in their mind, there's a moral principle which they're trying to apply, which is the betterment of society in the future through education. So
so they think there's something that ought to happen
exactly.
as well.
There's an ought there.
Yeah.
Right. Which undermines their argument.
Yeah.
Because science only gives you what is. Science doesn't give you what ought to be.
Right.
You have to go to moral philosophy or faith or to talk about what ought to be.
You see that a lot with a lot of the innovation and things that happen in Silicon Valley, where somebody comes up with an idea or a new kind of technology, and nobody stops to say, okay, we can do this, or we could do this, but should we do this?
Right.
It's like with Elon Musk is developing some Neuralink thing, and it's like under the guise of, allowing paraplegics and things like that to control things. But that eventually it's just going to be people, regular people putting it in their brains. And there seems to be no discussion around like, okay, should we do this? Should we have a brain to technology interface? That seems like a recipe for disaster.
Well,
this goes back to that great philosophical movie, Jurassic Park. You remember when Jeff Goldblum says, well, just because we can do it doesn't mean we ought to do it.
Yeah.
And when the dinosaurs attack, that's nature taking its revenge on humans, thinking they can control nature.
Yeah.
In fact, that is the subject of the third lecture or the third section of this book, which he calls the Abolition of Man. And by that, he is referring to man's conquest of nature. And this is what you're talking about, Aaron, where if I can just make all this high tech, well, it's good for society. And we're discovering it's not good for society. I think we may have mentioned in past podcasts a good documentary called The Social Dilemma that is interviewing many of the people from Silicon Valley who developed technology. In fact, one of them in the documentary invented the like
the like button.
Yeah, it's Facebook and other social media.
And he now regrets it, not realizing how it is going to condition people. And fascinatingly enough, C.S. Lewis uses the word conditioners as people who are shaping the way others see reality. And so now there are these people who helped create social media that do not allow their own children to have cell phones because they recognize that it is destroying them. And that's what Lewis means by the abolition of man. So what he is predicting is coming true.
Well, he calls it stepping outside the Tao, the conditioners. Once again, if you read that Hideous Strength, it's a wonderful illustration. These people Mark Studdick is the husband in this young couple, the Studdicks, who are spiritually unanchored, and they put him in the normal room, but everything in the normal room is abnormal. The walls aren't exactly vertical. The paintings that seem to be symmetrical have these small differences. And they're trying to wear down his sense that there's this objective symmetry or normalcy. And they're definitely, as I say, one of these fellows is wearing a pince nez. He says at the beginning of that Hideous Strength, this is a tall tale about devilry, but if you want to read what I'm trying to expose, please look at my other book, The Abolition of Man. So he's writing this kind of almost as a companion to that Hideous Strength.
Yeah. He talks in this chapter, I was just going to read a quote. He says, he's talking about man's conquest of nature and like, what is it really in service of? What does it really accomplish? And I think one of his good points in this chapter is that we're always making a decision about exercising power over our descendants. We're choosing for them the world that will be, and we're literally lording over them, or we're allowing our ancestors to make those decisions for us. And so there's a sense in which the people at the end of time won't actually be the most powerful because they're the ones that have had most of the power taken away from them. We've decided for them how things will be. And so he says, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well.
And that's what he means. It's the abolition of man, our indiscriminate use of our natural resources is abolishing humans.
In his context, they were thinking a lot of pollution. That was the big discussion back then. I have some old Superman comics, and there's whole storylines about pollution and the air, and before the EPA was created. But I mean, that's been an ongoing discussion of, can a generation choose to sacrifice productivity or, whatever it is at the expense of the future? Like, can we choose to love the generation that's next to come more than ourselves and give up something? And it seems like we're kind of incapable of doing that as a species.
Well, here's 3 examples. One is the airplane. As soon as it's invented, within a decade, people are saying, we could use this to drop bombs on other people.
Yeah.
So you have the conquest over nature, the age-old dream of being able to fly, and it's followed very quickly by human conquest over other humans.
Yeah.
I remember when drones were first invented, I said, I wonder how long it will take for people to weaponize them. And it wasn't very long at all.
Yeah.
Pretty soon they said, let's use it for reconnaissance. Oh, let's go ahead and add some rockets to these things. Turn them into
and
weapons.
the same thing with cars. At first it was a liberating thing. You could, travel long distances and, take your stuff to market and, be more productive. But now, poor people are stuck in traffic for an hour driving back to work, driving back and forth to work every day. And it feels like, something, we've lost something in the process.
Well, there's 2 other examples. One is contraception, that if you choose not to have a child, later on, that soul will say, I wanted to exist. I didn't want you to have a more affluent life without children or with few children. And his 3rd example is propaganda. Whoever has the means of information distribution, whether it's a newspaper or radio or the internet, you can get your message out much more effectively.
Yeah.
Right. And we see this now that it's created this radically polarized culture in America today because people believe their own propaganda, whether it has any connection to reality or not.
Well, and it used to be that you would have these newspapers and there was sort of a commitment to journalistic integrity.
Right.
But now when sort of anyone can broadcast themselves on the internet, the way that you get attention is by taking some contrary opinion or contrary idea or disagreeing with the consensus. And so you just get sort of a chaos. It's like a, just absolute anarchy of ideas out there. And you can just sort of choose your own adventure of what you want to believe in the world by picking and choosing who you're going to listen to.
Well, I was going to say that even with the internet, it's even hard to discern truth. In the USA Today, almost every day, they have a list of postings where it says, oh, this was a building being blown up. And they said, no, that was actually a factory fire in China 5 years ago. And here's a Ukrainian jet doing a dogfight with a Russian jet. And they say, no, actually, these are 2 French airplanes that are doing maneuver. So even your sense of objectively what you're seeing is being undermined.
Can be misused.
The news organizations in the old days were very chagrined when they made a mistake, and they would have to
Right.
list. They would have to post a correction. But nowadays, anybody can post anything, and everybody else has to figure out, well, is that true? Is that even not just is it good or bad, but is that even reality, or is that just somebody's presentation of reality?
Which makes relevant. Lewis talks in this last section, The Abolition of Man, about needing to value quality over quantity. And people are paying attention to quantity. It's how many followers do they have on Facebook or now on Twitter? Oh, I need to pay attention to quantity. Forget quality. Is this accurate? Is this critical thinking?
Right.
So there's a lot of prescience that Lewis has here. And he does get... he attacks science. He sees science as part of the problem because of technology and the things we're talking about.
I wouldn't put it that way. He said just the opposite. No matter how I qualify it, people will see this as an attack on science. So it's basically science or technology is a kind of power, and people tend to abuse their power.
Right. That's what I meant.
Yeah, let's not call it an attack on science.
Because he goes on to say, like, science could actually be the one that, helps us solve this problem, if we use it correctly.
Right. And thank you for qualifying that. That's what I meant, that science, the abuse of science. And then he gives as a alternative Martin Buber's I-thou relationship. And that's so relevant to the environment.
Yeah.
We have to see that we are in an I-thou relationship with our environment rather than more technology to conquer our environment.
Yeah.
Speaking of science, one of my favorite passages in the whole book, he's talking about how science is actually quite a bit like magic.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. And the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men.
Yeah.
The solution is technique. And I think it's fascinating that he actually sees technology becoming... he says in another book that they're actually twins. The reason magic didn't survive is because it didn't work. But science did survive because it did work. But they had the same underlying impulses.
I want to nature.
Yeah, sometimes you see these experiments in the Middle East. They have an entire island shaped like a palm tree, which they made out of sand. It's an incredible technological feat. But then you're saying, once again, just because you can do it, should you do it?
Yeah.
When there's people in your own country who aren't living with decent food and shelter, should you be using all this money?
Yeah.
Anytime you have a concentration of money or power or technology in the few, you're probably going to see these really horrendous abuses.
Yeah. One of my favorite arguments he makes in this last chapter is that human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man.
Right.
This argument that we can do all these things externally and fly in planes and things like that, but our own human nature is going to be our sort of worst enemy and the hardest thing to conquer. And then later on, he kind of returns to this idea of nature, and he says, we reduce things to mere nature in order that we may conquer them. The price of conquest is to treat a thing as mere nature. And he goes on to say, the soul does not become nature till we can psychoanalyze her. And so I just, coupled with his comment about human nature, I think he makes a really good point. And there's a thing that we tend to see in science today where instead of talking about love, we talk about it in terms of responsive chemicals in our brain. And we deconstruct the idea even of feelings, talk about it in terms of hormones and stuff. And he talks about that a little bit in some of his other books. But I just thought that was a really relevant point of how we try to turn our bodies into machines almost and deconstruct ourselves.
Well, and there too is his response to modernism, because Freudianism was really big at the time, which explains human behavior in terms of suppressed desires. And then that became an alternative religion, and Marxism became an alternative religion where it's just a matter of the socioeconomic inequities, and that explains everything. And so he wants to get away from that to say, no, there is a universal Tao. And sure enough, his criticism of Freudianism, even psychologists now are kind of embarrassed by Freud.
Well, he was very prescient. He did say in the year before he went out and gave the first broadcast talks, he went around in 1940 to RAF bases and gave lectures on morality to personnel. And he was struck that they, first of all, when he used the word creature, they thought he meant animal. He meant a created thing. And they said, oh, I love Rover. He's my favorite creature. all creatures, great and small. But he also said they had very little sense of personal sin. They felt like, oh, you have these complexes that need to be resolved, or else you belong to a class which is victimizing another class.
It's a disease or something. Yeah.
And they didn't really think about personal right and wrong. So that's why he stressed that so much, the idea of the moral law in this book and then also in Mere Christianity.
Yeah.
Crystal, you were giving a modern example when Woody Allen had a number of objectionable activities, and his explanation was, well, the heart wants what it wants.
Right. Yeah.
And that was a classic
autonomy
statement of the appetites. Basically, he's saying, I'm canceling out my moral sentiments, my chest, because of my appetites. So he's actually illustrating beautifully what he thought he was being profound, but he was just becoming a man without a chest.
I was going to say, Lewis says, he says, if man chooses to treat himself as raw material he will be, but he becomes mere appetite.
Right. And in a book like this, I wanted to mention a passage on how you decry moral values, or you say these are just subjective sentiments. They're basically emotional responses. They're not about reality. And then people discover that as society breaks down, they go, what's happening? And part of it is, well, the values and the philosophy that you've been propagating, people are starting to act on those. So at the end of this lecture in Men Without Chest, he says, in a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chest and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. That was the end of the first lecture, and it's such a beautiful conclusion to what he's been talking about.
One other thing I want to mention that I liked before we get into some problems we feel with this text, he makes the statement that you can't invent new values. And at first I balked at that because, well, America invented a new value when it denounced slavery, but...
Actually, we were among the last to get rid of slavery.
I know, that's true. But then he goes on to make this really good point that changes happen within the Tao. And an example that I thought of is when America was created, the Declaration of our independence. The Declaration of Independence says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that is a wonderful appeal to the Tao. Yes, all men are created equal. But the trouble is, at the time in which that was stated, it meant all men, not women.
Yeah.
And it was in the context of separating from England, which had a very aristocratic class privileged society.
Born into different
and they
classes.
wanted to say, no, class shouldn't make a difference. But the signers of this declaration, some of them had slaves.
Yeah.
So they clearly did not consider African Americans to be part of all men are created equal.
Yeah.
So they recognize the Tao, but over time they recognize the need to refine and become more inclusive, perhaps we could say, of the Tao. And so that helped get me beyond something that really bothered me, because we do see change in values over time.
Right. Well, he talks about development of the Tao. Confucius says negatively, don't do to other people what you don't want someone to do to you.
Right.
And then Christ made it positive, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. So he thinks that's a development. For the Declaration of Independence, it said all men are created equal. And if you look closely, there's a little asterisk And down at the bottom it says, does not apply to women, people of color,
Yeah.
or even people who don't own land. You had to be
Yeah,
a property
that's
owner
right.
to vote.
Yeah, very much so.
But they were thinking of America, as you say, versus Britain. Britain had a very hierarchical society. Ben Franklin said, in Europe, they ask, who is your father? In America, we ask, what can you do? So that's what he means by equality. But you're right. But in the development of the Tao, people said, well, that principle of equality needs to be applied more fully.
Right.
To people of color, to women, to people who don't own land. So there's a development. It's a good principle, but it needs to be applied more broadly. It needs to be amplified and developed.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Was there anything else that you guys had from the book in terms of positive stuff before we maybe talk about some of our core criticisms?
Okay. I wanted to read the ending of the whole book. These are a series of lectures. And so you can imagine coming to a lecture, and this is how Lewis finishes off his third lecture. He's talking about reductionism. You can't take love and turn it into molecules in the brain. You can't take morality and turn it into self-interest. And so in his ending of his critique of reductionism, he says, you cannot go on explaining away forever. Here's what it's really about. It's really about money, or it's really about repressed emotions, or it's really about class struggle. You cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you've explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles, especially moral principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. Wonderful ending to the book.
Yeah. And we need to mention the appendix as well, where he just put side by side all these pronouncements from different religions that endorse the same moral code.
Yeah.
Right.
To prove his point that this isn't just Christians, that there are moral absolutes.
There are things in common between these different traditions. Definitely.
Right.
And Michael Ward, in his recent book, After Humanity, gives a lot of context and a lot of examples. So he talks more about that appendix and those examples and how they can even be expanded. Yeah, it's a recent book called After Humanity, which is actually much thicker than Abolition of Man. Lewis was delivering his addresses to a learned audience. And so there are a lot of allusions, both ancient and contemporary, that you need help with.
Gotcha.
And there's even a lot of phrases that we don't quite understand who he's thinking about when he throws out a phrase about the herd instinct.
Right.
So Michael Ward did a good job of providing a book-length gloss on Abolition of Man and helping you understand the cultural context much more fully.
Did Lewis expand on or change these lectures between when he delivered them and then the book form?
That is a good question. It came out fairly soon after the lectures, so there wouldn't have been a lot of work.
Gotcha.
I have a feeling they're pretty close to what he delivered.
Okay.
As to Michael Ward's book, one of the things I like about it is that he does identify places where Lewis isn't being precise enough in his language that can lead you astray. And he does include both people who praise Abolition of Man, but he includes statements by people who have criticized Abolition of Man. But one thing he overlooks is something that Lewis himself overlooked that I consider to be one of the greatest flaws of abolition, even though I think I've made clear what I value about it. And that was beginning his whole discussion with the idea of the waterfall. And he elaborates on that to imply that there is this universal aesthetic sense that we recognize the sublimity of waterfalls. But that is not the case. And there is a fantastic book called Mountain Gloom and Mountain Glory, subtitled The Development of the Aesthetics of the Infinite, that talks about 17th century attitudes towards nature and how, with the development of science in the 17th century, attitudes towards nature started to change.
Yeah.
And in this long book written by a professor and published by Cornell University back in 1963, she gives example after example after example of people writing about mountains and waterfalls as ugly.
Ooh.
That mountains are warts and pimples on the face of the earth. That a waterfall is like the pus coming out of a pimple.
Dun, dun, dun.
She quotes one person who describes a waterfall as scrofulous scum.
Ugh.
And she has numerous examples of this.
Really?
And so she wanted to explore why people in the 17th century thought this way. And she discovered that within both Jewish and Christian tradition, many people thought of mountains as the result of sin.
Oh.
So that when among the Midrash, Jewish Midrash tradition, that mountains developed out of the blood when Cain killed Abel. In the Christian tradition, the idea of Adam and Eve's fall as not only were they cast out of the garden, but a world that was totally smooth suddenly became corrupted and all these mountains started developing. And because people associated mountains with sin, they didn't see them as beautiful.
Wow.
Well, it goes back to the Platonic idea that the perfect shape is the circle.
Is smooth.
And so if the globe had been
Exactly.
circular and smooth, it was perfect. But when you live in a fallen state, you suddenly have high points and low points, and things are rugged rather than smooth.
That is crazy.
Well, she has some practical examples. People would build a cabin in the mountains looking out on the Alps.
One of the King Louis.
Yeah, and there would be no windows looking at the mountainscape. They part of it is nature was so unconquered, they were somewhat intimidated by nature.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was part of it. But they actually believed then that the beauty of nature was what was most natural, which strikes us, we just can't even understand it today because we just see mountains. We have pictures of mountains on our walls. Mountains are beautiful. Waterfalls are beautiful. But what was most natural in the 17th century was geometrical accuracy. That something gives us pleasure if it be exactly round, and hence the exact roundness of the earth, the smoothness of the earth
symmetry.
Before, mountains ruined its beauty. And one author in the 17th century says, for symmetry, equality, and correspondence of parts is the discernment of reason, not the object of sense. So the reason recognizes beauty as geometric.
Wow.
And if you think of the Palace of Versailles, if you've ever been there, the gardens are totally geometric.
Totally, yeah.
They were planted in the 17th century because symmetry, geometry, even the word artifice used to be a more positive term.
Really?
Because it's about the human shaping of things.
Oh.
And when in the 17th century, Sir Christopher Wren also said that there are two causes of beauty, natural and customary. Natural is from geometry. So even that word natural, most of us would say, no, natural beauty is when you don't do anything. You don't put it into geometrical shapes and forms. So the word natural even applies to different things.
Wow.
In Shakespeare's day, it was only natural to see a tan as ugly. And even the word tan meant a person's skin looked like a hide that had been tanned.
Oh.
But that's because only poor people
Yeah,
had
worked out on the sun.
sunburned
It's
skin.
a sign of poverty.
Right.
Yeah.
And beauty has tended to be aligned with people with money and power. Well, by the 20th century, a tan was considered beautiful because people with money and power
And
could
leisure.
afford and
Go to
leisure,
the beach.
Yeah.
go on cruises, go to the beach, own a swimming pool.
Yeah.
So if you have a tan, wow, you're probably not poor. Whereas poor working people have to be inside in factories all day.
Wow.
Even in Pride and Prejudice, somebody mentions her tan.
Oh, really?
And it's kind of a joke because it makes her look working class.
Oh.
If you're upper class, you always have an umbrella or what's the word I'm looking for to keep the sun off?
Parasol.
Parasol.
Which means against the sun. Yeah.
Protection
keep off
against
the sun.
Huh.
So by starting with the waterfall as an example of universal value, Lewis, for anybody who's acquainted with 17th century values, that is a little disturbing. And this goes along with something you were saying earlier, David, that there's a difference between moral absolutes and aesthetic absolutes.
Yeah.
That aesthetics tend to be more shaped by culture.
Yeah.
Like a tan.
Well, Lewis himself in other books recognizes a certain subjectivity. In one book, he says, I heard a Zulu war chant, and it sounded to me very wistful and poignant. It didn't sound at all like it would rouse you to battle. So he noticed a certain subjectivity in the music of that. He also says in Reflections of the Psalms that people don't start celebrating nature until they're cut off from nature. In the classical world, it was people in Rome and Alexandria who were talking about the beauties of nature. People who lived in nature, that was just the world. What is there to celebrate?
Gotcha.
He said it's like fish don't even think about water because that's their whole environment. So Lewis himself recognizes there was some subjectivity to aesthetic values. So I agree with you. The waterfall isn't the best example. He also makes the example of a Roman father saying it's sweet and decorous to give your life for your country. Now, he's writing in England when they're fighting the Nazis, and it does seem like a good moral value to be willing to give your life for your country. He apparently didn't know the poem by Wilfred Owen, which really critiques that poem.
Oh, really?
If you're being in the trenches, being a victim of shelling and mustard gas and rats and disease, it's actually called Dulcet in Decorum. The poem is, and he's mocking the idea that it's sweet and appropriate to die for your country. And also, at the time he's writing this, ironically, Hitler's realizing that you've got to propagandize people from early on. So he creates the Hitler Youth.
Right.
And they believe more than anyone that it's sweet and decorous to die for one's country.
Right.
But they're not dying for a good cause.
Right.
Yeah.
So I like the overall thrust of his arguments, but sometimes his examples don't seem that well chosen.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's also hard to read it a little bit, some of his pronouncements about the future and the way things are going to go, because postmodernism happened, we didn't continue down this path of logical positivism and empiricism in reality, that some of his critiques, I mean, they feel very accurate for back then.
Exactly.
But they're not as relevant today because there's not a whole lot of logical positivists going around arguing for these, kind of approaches.
But I think there are a different set of conditioners. The way we're also conditioned by advertising, everyone feels like I need to be physically attractive.
Yeah.
Or I need to have money to be happy.
Yeah.
So I think you could argue that it's not exactly the scientists in the lab that are the conditioners. I think
just
it's
a different villain.
Yeah, we've got a small group of people who are controlling other people's values and making us judge right and wrong by what they want us to think, not by what's objectively true.
So what would you guys say is the takeaway from Abolition of Man? There's obviously a lot of good things in it. There's some critiques to be had. I want to go read that Mountain Gloom, Mountain Glory, Mountain Gloom, Mountain Glory book. So how should people approach this book?
Well, National Review rated it as one of the top 10 books of the century in terms of bringing philosophical clarity to people's minds.
Wow.
And in other surveys, it rates very high. William Bennett in The Art of Virtue talks about Abolition of Man quite a bit. So I think the overall thrust that there is this moral consensus, a moral ecology is what Michael Ward calls it. There are these interwoven tapestry of moral values that need to be respected.
Yeah.
And you ignore them at your peril. Not only the abolition of nature, but the abolition of human nature. I think that's a good emphasis. Right now, it's pretty much whatever I as an individual want.
Right.
It's not the consequences for my family or for society or for the future. I think some of his examples could have been more well chosen, but I think the general thrust, and also the idea of conditioners, that you don't want a situation in which a very small proportion of human beings have the power and the media and the money to impose their values on the rest of the culture. Right now, I think Hollywood and all those productions, they have far too much power over the general culture. It goes back to his whole point, which is moral education. Right now, you don't want to give everyone their own TV show, which is actually happening on TikTok.
Yeah.
That's not having good moral effects.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to have moral censorship, like the church having their index purgatorius or the things that couldn't be read by the Catholic Church. You have to go to a prior step of making sure that people have a robust moral education so that they don't say things like the heart wants what it wants, or they don't see how it's humorous to go through all these serial relationships.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason that there's so many people turning to homeschooling is they feel like secular culture is not just neutral, it's very pernicious. It's planting antisocial values into their children. So they're actually, in an indirect way, they're paying homage to Lewis and Abolition of Man by saying we need to take the moral education of our children into our own hands. We can't trust secular culture to do that for us.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. This is a good discussion.
My last words would be to seek justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly before your Lord. There's some good principles from the Tao to apply to your life.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.